So our topic today is how to spot and stop emotional abuse. And I would love you to share with your friends and family. If you're watching on demand, please tell your friends and family about this webinar. If you know anybody who you think might be experiencing emotional or verbal abuse or any type of abuse, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, it's all relevant. And if you're sharing or listening live, you can tell your friends now. And if you're listening later, then you can also share and tell your friends and family. Now, as I always say at the start of my webinars, I do not diagnose, heal, cure, treat any medical condition. And if you need to seek appropriate help, then please do so. Most of the information I share is based on my own personal experience, plus the experience of working with hundreds of clients. But it is up to you to take full responsibility for how you use any information that I may give out. And in particular, if you feel that you are in danger, especially potentially physical danger, please seek appropriate help from appropriate authorities and your support networks. Today, our agenda is what is emotional abuse? The signs and symptoms of emotional abuse, why it's so difficult to spot, and 3 steps to stopping abuse. Now, step 1 is we need to understand the problem. And so we're going to look at, well, what is a definition of emotional abuse? And to start with, we need to look at, well, what is abuse in general? And the definition in general is to treat with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. That's just one definition. There are many, but that's just one that I Googled and it came up and that's what I put in. So to treat with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. And emotional abuse is an act including confinement, isolation, verbal assault, humiliation, intimidation, infantilization, or any other treatment which may diminish the sense of identity, dignity, and self-worth. So emotional abuse and verbal abuse really affect our mind and our emotions, as you're going to see. Now, emotional abuse can occur by itself. In other words, somebody can just be emotionally abused by somebody, or in tandem with physical or sexual abuse. They go together. And some people, some therapists, do differentiate between emotional and verbal abuse, but I tend to put them together. People who call verbal abuse tend to say that it's because somebody is using words to verbally abuse. But if somebody does that, then it creates, and it is a form of emotional abuse because of how we feel about the words that are being spoken to us. So I tend to put the two together and I just call it emotional abuse. So how does unfair treatment or verbal abuse tend to show up? Well, the persecutor may do things like trying to isolate their victim, demean, undermine, put down, humiliate, terrorize. And the word terrorize comes from terrorist. They will try to instill fear. They will try to be superior or dominating, better than. And they will confuse and manipulate. And often there's what we call the Jekyll and Hyde syndrome, where one minute they can be very nice and the next minute they can be really mean and nasty. Now, just to continue on this, signs of emotional abuse from the abuser are things like verbal put-downs, humiliation, shaming, nastiness, unkindness, meanness, twisting words, turning things around, making it your fault, where originally you felt like they were doing something wrong and then they turn it around and then your mind goes into confusion. There's blaming, dismissing, ignoring, a lack of respect, a lack of acknowledgement. So these are all signs of what the abuser is doing, but often we don't understand it and we don't really recognize it until something happens where suddenly we start to understand what's actually going on. So all of this, all these verbal put downs, humiliation, shaming, etc., all of this can be going on, but we don't actually realize it's emotional or verbal abuse. And this is why, in a way, verbal and emotional abuse are much harder to spot than physical abuse, because physical abuse is very obvious. Somebody is physically hurting us. Although even when we're being physically abused, we can still go into rationalizing and justifying that person's behavior, so we're still not recognizing it at a mental mind level. Now, within us, signs that we're being emotionally abused will be things like we find ourselves walking on eggshells, we're afraid to speak our mind or our truth, we're afraid to speak up for ourselves, we're afraid to stand our ground, or we're waiting for the next bomb to drop. So ongoing nervousness, anxiety, fear, and terror. And if we split it up, because I tend to think of a human being as being physical, mind, emotions, spirit. If we split it up into these 4 quadrants, on a physical level, we may flinch when people go to touch us because we've had, this in particular, if we've had some physical abuse as well, is that our body is trying to protect ourselves and it's automatically flinching because we're afraid that it might be an unfair type of touch. And we may find that we have difficulty with physical contact with other people. We may find it's difficult to reach out and literally physically touch other people. We may gain weight. We may have eating disorders. We may be, or we will actually be, very stressed all the time, even if it's not conscious. And we may also very likely to be ungrounded and disconnected from our body. Will be very much in our head, not in our body, but again, we won't recognize, until we recognize what's really going on, we won't recognize that we are disconnected and ungrounded from our body. On an emotional level, we may become emotionally protective and defensive, or we may become passive and aggressive, and there may be emotional suppression and a lot of other signs of things going on at an emotional level. And in our mind, at a mental level, we may have patterns such as approval seeking, overworking to keep busy and avoid feelings, always busy doing and never being. Our mind's always overthinking, it's always racing, it never stops. And we also may have unclarity, confusion, we can't think clearly, doubt and worry. And all of these signs and symptoms are our body-mind's way of trying to protect ourselves from further abuse. And on a spiritual level, we may find that we have lack of clarity of our purpose or our mission in life or our passion. We just don't seem to be able to get connected with what we're here to do, what do we love to do, what is our purpose. So we'll feel off track, and that will bring depression and despondency, because ultimately what's happening is we've become disconnected from ourselves, and we've become disconnected from our true self or our higher self or our divine self, or whatever word you like to use for your true self. So there is this disconnection. And on a feeling level, we're likely to feel very hurt, angry, upset, betrayed, disrespected. We're going to feel that our boundaries have been violated emotionally, physically, mentally, maybe sexually. And that will all boil down to we feel bad, we feel unworthy. And what tends to happen then is that we turn this on ourselves. We turn this abuse that other people have given us, and we turn it on ourselves, because it's all stewing away inside. And if we're not recognizing it, then we make ourselves bad and we turn the abuse on ourselves. And that shows up as things like putting ourselves down, making ourselves wrong, always comparing ourselves with others in a negative light. We beat ourselves up, we have negative self-talk, and then we also do things like we overwork, we don't look after ourselves, we push ourselves too hard, we ignore our body's needs, we become a perfectionist. So all these habits stem from not feeling good enough. And then we will also have self-doubt, low self-confidence, low self-esteem, low self-worth. We're always less than other people. We're never good enough. And as a result of that, we will try and seek approval and love from other people because we don't love ourselves enough. And we also don't feel like we deserve love. We just don't feel deserving of love and happiness because through this abuse and this abusive treatment that we've experienced, we come to falsely believe that we don't deserve happiness. Now, when we put up with this unfair treatment on an ongoing basis, we start to suppress our emotions if we don't know how to deal with them. And we stop acting authentically and we lose touch with ourselves. And if this goes on for too long, it puts the body into such a state of imbalance that we start to experience symptoms and illness. And this can lead to even chronic debilitating illness. Now, for myself, just to give an example of abuse, it always starts in the family, but I'm not going to go into that here. But it turns up later in life because we will always keep repeating in our life what we haven't resolved. It's just the way life works. So I attracted myself to a partner who initially seemed okay, but then as he started to get more pressure happening and going on in his life, he started to take it out on me. But because I had this pattern of not believing in myself, not trusting myself, not loving myself, but not knowing that I had all of that going on, I was putting up with the behavior. It was very much a Jekyll and Hyde. Of 1 minute he'd be nice, the next minute he'd be really mean and nasty. My mind would go into confusion. I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know what was right. I wouldn't know what was wrong. And this went on for some time until eventually I started to really think, you know, this can't be right. It can't be right to be this unhappy all the time. It can't be right to be this confused all the time. And I think I need to try and sort this out, which I did. So a major sign of emotional abuse is this mental confusion and self-doubt. And I'm going to show why this is. So mental confusion and self-doubt are a sign that things are not okay and they're not acceptable to our body-mind. It is our body-mind's way of saying there's something wrong here. There's something not lining up. It just doesn't feel right to me, and so I'm going to send you the feeling of mental confusion and self-doubt. But the problem is, it's very difficult for us to recognize what's really going on underneath because we become so disconnected from ourselves and we've stopped trusting ourselves and we've stopped trusting our heart and our gut, and we're afraid of the consequences of standing up for ourselves. And all of this is set up. In my experience, what I've noticed, it's been set up in the first few years of life. It's whatever has happened in those first few years of life where we set up these patterns of how we deal with people. And ultimately, also, it's difficult to spot because we have this low self-worth, this low self-esteem, and we also do not feel safe to be our true self. So why this confusion and doubt? Well, really what's happening is these three brains that we have inside of us, which I spoke about on another webinar, which you can go and look at, these three brains get confused and they're not in alignment. The three brains are saying different things and there's no congruency and there is no alignment. So if we look at these three brains and these are reflected in different parts of our head brain, we have the neocortex, which is concerned with logical thinking and reasoning and rationalizing and coming up with solutions and creative thinking and trying to make meaning of things. That is our neocortex. But our limbic system is concerned with the emotions, the truth of how we feel. How do we truly feel about what is happening in our life? And these feelings come automatically, and they're very connected with the heart brain, our heart brain. And then we have the brainstem, which is the oldest part of our brain, which is concerned with survival. It's concerned with literal physical survival. So we have these three parts which correlate with our three brains, and they all need to be on the same page. But what happens when we're in an abusive situation is we're getting all the feedback coming from these three brains, but we don't know how to interpret it. So, for example, the gut brain, which correlates with the brainstem, will feed back, I don't feel safe, right? So at a purely physiological level, I don't feel safe. And if something is happening emotionally, it will still trigger that physiological response in the body. If it's either a threat emotionally or a threat physically, the same response happens in the body at a physiological level. It's all about survival. So somebody says something really mean to us and we don't feel safe. At the same time, our heart brain will feed back information about our feelings and our values, because our heart brain is very much about our values. You know, what is my value about how people treat me? And our heart will send back feelings such as sadness or upset or hurt. But what happens is the head brain has trained itself to override what the heart and the gut brains, or the limbic system and the brainstem, are feeding back. And it does this, as you're going to see in a moment, in order to protect itself, or it's trying to protect us, but it's actually not doing it in the right way. We need to learn a better way to protect ourselves. But the head brain will come in and it will come up with a justification or a rationalization. And a rationalization is a rational lie. It's a very logical, rational lie, which seems to feel true, such as, well, I can't say anything, or I can't stand up for myself, or I better not speak up, or whatever the rationalization is. And so it actually prevents us from dealing with the situation and resolving the situation. So we have to start to recognize the feedback that is coming back from all three brains and all three parts of our head brain, because it comes back to safety. Physical safety. As an organism, we're trying to stay alive. We need to stay alive, because if we're not alive, we're dead. And it's also emotional safety. And if we don't feel emotionally safe, the body will create the same feedback as if we're not feeling physically safe. And also, our body wants us to be happy. This is where the spiritual side of things come in, to be on purpose, to fulfill our purpose and our passion, is that we're meant to be happy. But that's quite a difficult thing to believe when we've spent years experiencing abuse. Now, there are many human fears, but 4 core human fears are the fear of rejection, the fear of loss, the fear of feeling our feelings, and the fear of feeling vulnerable. And these are deep fears within us, because if we feel these things at an emotional level, it triggers a feeling of threat to our life. Because if we take ourselves back to our tribal nature, if we are, for example, rejected and abandoned by our tribe, then we may literally not survive. So really, these 4 core human fears relate to a fear of abandonment and even death. So, as I said before, fear of emotional abandonment has the same physiological response in the body as fear of physical abandonment or death. And therefore, we will do anything to prevent these fears coming true. We will do anything to avoid feeling rejected, vulnerable, losing someone, or feeling our feelings, because unconsciously this relates to dying. So safety and protection are absolutely key. And we have what we could call 3 protective personality types or behaviors. We have the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. So obviously, usually people correlate the persecutor with the person who's doing the abuse, the victim with the person who's being abused, and the rescuer is the person trying to get in between the victim and the persecutor, trying to save the day. And here's just another little cute diagram showing the same thing. But if we look a little deeper, we find that the passive behavior, which normally comes from the victim, so-called, examples could be, for example, I never speak up, I allow others to walk all over me, I allow others to I allow myself to be disrespected, I'm afraid of taking action, and I'm the meek mouse. So another word that we could use for victim, because people tend to take offense at that word, is disempowered. Okay, so we can either be empowered or we can be disempowered. And usually we turn into a victim, if you like, because we were disempowered in our early childhood, and that is the identity that we take on. And interestingly enough, these identities are very connected with our gut brain. Now, the abuser will also, will have aggressive behavior. But this aggressive behavior can actually come from either the abuser, and it can also come from the victim trying to protect themselves. But either way, the aggressive behavior will be things like attacking verbally, emotionally, mentally, or physically. That is abusive behavior. And all those behaviors that I put right at the beginning of the webinar, such as putting down, demeaning, shaming, humiliating, etc. And this aggressive or demeaning behavior, it can be quite minor, it can be quite subtle, or it can be very major, and there can be everything in between. And there will also sometimes be defensive behavior, where in order to protect ourselves, either as the abuser or the victim, for example, we defend ourselves emotionally, verbally, physically, and we may, for example, have difficulty receiving feedback or guidance from others. But it boils down to the fact that we're just trying to protect ourselves. We're just trying to survive. We're just doing the best with what we have. And then the rescuer, who is more of a mediator, is potentially more on the victim end of the scale. They try to get in between the victim and the abuser to stop the abuse, and they try to save people. And there can also be a lot of fear for that rescuer. So these are all the setups of the problem. It's all set up in childhood, and we develop these core beliefs that we're not good enough, we're not worthy enough, and that leads to certain behaviors. And some of us will turn into the victim and be the poor me type, and I can't stand up for myself, and I'm disempowered and I'm weak. And some people will turn into the abuser type in order to protect themselves. There's still the disempowerment and the pain underneath. They just play it out in a different way. And I go into much more detail in my Stop the Bullies program about that. So if we come to, okay, well, what do we do about this? Just to introduce some ideas. First of all, we have to become aware that we're being abused. And this may sound very obvious, but it's actually not. Our rational mind, which we call the rational liar sometimes, because it's rationalizing, it is very, very strong. It can become very, very strong because it is trying to protect ourselves. So our mind can come up with all sorts of excuses which feel very, very logical, plausible, real as to why we shouldn't leave the person, why we shouldn't stand up for ourselves, why we shouldn't speak our truth, why we shouldn't say anything, why we should just put up with it. It goes on and on and on. There is an unending list of rationalizations and justifications that our mind will come up with, which seems so absolutely true. And even if somebody else points something out to us, we don't even hear them. So even though this may sound like a very trite step, it's actually a very, very important step. And I'll share my story of how I became aware that I was being abused. So I was in a relationship, as I mentioned before, with this man, and it was just like living with Jekyll and Hyde, and it went on for months, and I was feeling upset. I wasn't sleeping, very hard to sleep when we're dealing with this sort of behavior, because our body literally doesn't feel safe enough to go to sleep. And I really had no idea what was going on. It was just happening, but I really didn't know that it was called abuse. And then one day I was in the library and a book popped out at me on the bookshelf. It literally just caught my eye. I wasn't even looking for a book. I was there at the library with somebody else, waiting with them, browsing around while I was waiting, and this book popped out at me. And I picked it off the shelf, and I hadn't even looked really at the title of the book, but I picked it off the shelf, and I opened up the book, and it opened up to a chapter which said Jekyll and Hiding. And for months I'd been telling myself it's like living with Jekyll and Hyde. And here I was, I opened up this book and it said Jekyll and Hiding. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I started reading a few lines and it was like, wow, this is me. And so I took that book home and I read it from cover to cover. And I started to recognize that what was being written about in the book was actually happening to me. And the title of that book was called Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. Now, of course, it's not just the men doing things to women. The women can do things to men as well. But obviously, in my case, that was very applicable. So I highly recommend that book, Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. And I read that book, and that was the beginning of me becoming aware of what the problem was. And once I became aware, I then started to become aware that there's something wrong here. It doesn't feel right. I'm not happy. Something has to change. So that was when I came to step 2, which was to decide that I wanted to do something about it. I had to make a decision. Now, that process went on for 6 months. So sometimes, even though we start to recognize a problem, it doesn't mean that we automatically are able to do something right away. Sometimes it will, but for me, it went on for 6 months. And this is because the mind kept coming in with lots of rationalizations and justifications. And often one of the most common justification or rationalization is, well, maybe things will get better. Maybe they'll change. They keep saying they're going to change, so maybe they will change. Maybe we can salvage this relationship. Maybe I'll just hang in there a bit longer. These are the sort of thoughts that tend to go on. And it may well be that things can turn around, but often the things do not change because both parties have to change. And even if we're changing and the other party isn't changing, we're ultimately not going to reach our destination. So we have to decide that we want to do something about it and that we're no longer willing to tolerate unacceptable behavior from others, which is making us feel really, really upset and sad and angry and frustrated, etc., etc. So I went back and forth for 6 months. Again, a lot of mental confusion still, a lot of self-doubt. And I tried to do something about it, but nothing was really changing. And then I had what I call, and this is very common, a last straw moment, where something happened, which I'm not going to go into the detail of here, but something happened and I thought, you know what, I'm absolutely not going to put up with this anymore. And I made a decision. It was a final decision. That's it. I'm done with this and I'm getting out of this relationship. And within a week, I was out. Now, even though I was gone, it took another 6 months to really extricate myself energetically, because when we're in an abusive relationship, whether it's emotionally abusive or physically abusive, there's a lot of what I call sticky energy, which keeps us connected with these people. It's very sticky, unhealthy energy, literally at an energetic level. And we have to disconnect ourselves energetically from these people, which can take quite a bit of work. So it took another 6 months of really cutting those ties, and every time that he wanted to contact me again and I felt the draw to be together again, which is all my old emotional baggage not being resolved. And so it would, there was more work to be done even after the separation. Now, I'm not saying that we have to separate in a relationship to find a resolution, but it does have to come to that. But if we are going to stay together, both parties have to work on themselves. That is for sure. Again, we have to work individually on ourselves to sort our own personal issues out, and then we have to work together as a couple to work our issues out. And whether that's a partner couple or a parent to child couple, it's the same thing. We've got to work on our individual stuff, and then we need to work to resolve our joint communication. Now, along the way, we're going to have to learn to be assertive. We're going to have to learn how to overcome the fear of being ourselves and speaking our truth and being our true self. We're going to have to learn how to create clear boundaries, and we're going to have to learn how to be our authentic true self. And we're going to have to learn how to recognize unfair treatment, and we're going to have to learn how to differentiate unfair versus fair treatment. In other words, we're going to have to learn the difference between what it feels like inside our body-mind when somebody treats us fairly as opposed to when somebody treats us unfairly. So this means we're going to have to learn how to tune into our own internal guidance system, which are these 3 brains. And we're going to have to learn how to trust ourselves again, because what has happened in the past is that we have lost trust. We didn't know this happened, but we lost trust. We lost trust in others because they weren't treating us well and it didn't feel right. We couldn't understand it at the time, but something inside of us said to us that doesn't feel right. And so we stopped trusting these other people. And as a result of that, we also stopped trusting ourselves, because we had our internal guidance system saying, this is right for me. But then we have external information coming in from the other people saying, no, this is the right way. And this is what sets up this confusion, because our internal guidance system is saying one thing, but the external people are saying something else. And if we're a small child, we defer to these outer people, these gods, these adults. We believe they must be right because they're there to look after me. And that's where all this mental confusion gets set up, and we stop being in contact and being able to use our 3 brains, and we stop trusting our heart brain and our gut brain. So we have to learn to start trusting our heart and our gut brains. So let's do a very quick exercise to listen into your internal guidance system. Obviously, do not do this if you're driving or operating machinery. But if you're either sitting or lying or even standing, just close your eyes. And I'd like you to bring to your mind a time when somebody did not treat you well. They treated you unfairly. And just allow whatever pops into your mind to pop into your mind without any judgment or resistance. And as that memory pops into your mind, I want you to tune into your heart. How did your heart feel about this truthfully, without any rationalization or censorship? How did your heart feel? It's likely to be some feelings, some emotions, some even sensations in the heart area, in the chest area. And then go down into your gut. How did your gut feel? What were the physical sensations or felt sensations in your gut? Was there tension and constriction, or was there a good feeling? Because normally, if something is not right for us, we're going to tense and constrict. If something is right for us, we're going to feel a sense of relief. So what did your gut say? Your gut doesn't speak words, and neither does your heart. They speak feelings and sensations. But they're still speaking to you. We have to learn to interpret this body communication. And then go into your head. What did your mind say after the feedback from the heart and the gut? Did it agree with the heart and the gut? Or did it come up with a rationalization, a rational lie? What did the head say? And then come back into your heart and ask how your heart feels about what your head said. And ask how your heart feels about what the gut said. And just see, are they on the same page, or is there a discrepancy and a disagreement between the three brains? So that's just a little exercise just to tune in very quickly to these three brains so that you can start listening to yourself and trusting yourself more. Now, there are also some self-awareness questions you can ask yourself if you think you may be being verbally or emotionally or in any other way abused. Ask yourself, what am I tolerating in my life? What am I putting up with? But I keep rationalizing away. I keep putting up with it. And literally write a list. You can ask yourself, where do I need to put myself first more? Where am I putting other people before me? And where am I putting myself last? And where do I need to put myself first more? You can ask yourself, where do I need to speak my truth more? Where do I need to create clear boundaries? And you can ask yourself, what would my best friend advise me to do? Or what would I advise my best friend to do? What would somebody else say to you? Or what would you say to somebody else? Often that helps us to get perspective. And we also need to seek appropriate help if needed and where needed. So ask for help, tell someone. Often we can feel very isolated, and that if we're being emotionally and verbally abused, that is one of the patterns of the abuser, is to isolate their victim, inverted commas. So it's very important to start to get the courage, which comes from the gut brain, to speak up and tell people and get help. And safety is absolutely paramount. So seek appropriate help from the appropriate authorities and support groups, as I said at the start. And if you want more information from me, I have several online programs that may be helpful. I have my Stop the Bullies mini program, an Introduction to Emotional Mastery, which helps you to become more aware of your feelings. I have a Smile Your Way to Inner Peace program, which is all about going into the different organs and clearing out all the fear, the stress, the anger, the sadness, the hurt, which all gets stored inside of us, and we have to clear it out. And then soon my Opening Your Heart to Love series, where we cultivate these qualities of the heart to reconnect with ourselves. So we cultivate trust, openness, love, gratitude, and respect, so that we reopen our hearts to ourselves and to life in general and to other people. And you can find all of those from my website, kimknighthealth.com. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on my next webinar.